This is my first time participating in this event, and it has blown me away. I have so much enjoyed sitting and learning from so many people that are as passionate about the subject matter as I am. I'm Brent Keniston. I work with Trivere. We are a platinum NetIQ solutions provider. We do a lot of identity and access management, access governance for a number of federal agencies. My most notable accomplishment over the last couple of months has been, I believe, the completion of the first successful derived credentials pilot that has even passed a security assessment for draft 879-2 for becoming a derived credentials issuer, which was not a light lift. And so I'm very happy about that. We also have integrated with the GSA MSO US access system for PIV and derived PIV integration. A number of you in this room are my good friends, and I will give all of my success to my collaborators here. Without my federal counterparts, I could not succeed to any of the efforts that we've applied ourselves for. Today, I'm excited to share with you an expert panel that has come up with a couple of pieces of subject matter that are very passionate for them. I think this will be a very interesting discussion. We have on the panel with us today Arlette Hart. She's the Chief Information Security Officer for the FBI. We also have next to her Roger Clark. I'm sorry, Emery. We have Emery Shulak, who is the Chief Information Security Officer and the Privacy Officer for the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS. Next to Emery, I have Roger Clark.
We switched the order on him. That's why throws him in.
Roger Clark is the Acting Director of Office of Cybersecurity and Acting Chief Information Security Officer for the Department of Commerce, working with our friends in the Office of the CIO there. And then on the end of the panel, we have Chris Lowe. He is the Chief Information Security Officer at the United States Department of Agriculture. And so now I'd like to take a few minutes and give each panel participant a minute or two to talk a little bit about what is on the top of mind awareness for them and their staff. Arlette, would you like to keep that on?
Sure. Actually, I'm going to expand it not just to my staff and my team and things like that, because if we do that, then we're going to go down to mobility and the cloud and the relative controls and the relative risk and things like that. So I deal with that every day. But one of the things that I see out in the rest of the world that I think if we just, as everybody, every organization and every person starts going down this path, we will get a lot further ahead of the cybersecurity threat. And that is basic network hygiene. Patch your systems. I know nobody knows this, but what was it? The Verizon report said like 80% of all the vulnerabilities were old and exploited vulnerabilities from a long time ago. And so one of the things that every chance I get with any forum, it's like, get a patching system in place, get it done, get those silly things finished, get the processes in place for your 0 days, for your 7-day patches, for your 30-day patches, get your servers patched. Just go down that path and make sure that your organization is aggressive about patching those systems. It'll save a lot of those stupid phishing things that all exploit your vulnerable systems, or well, 90% of them do. But it just saves a lot of the other pain that you feel later when you actually can get your systems and you say, okay, I have this level of basic network hygiene, and I can count on that. And then after that, then I just have to do the hard work.
Hey, Emery Shulak with CMS and formerly from Homeland Security. And I guess building kind of on what you just said, we go back to the Verizon report again. They listed top two capabilities. One was 24% of all incidents, can be at some level mitigated through patch management. And 24% can be mitigated through some level through multi-factor authentication. So, two factors here, which we're talking about 48% of our vulnerabilities, have a clear and defined path to address key concerns. And I think, when you look at where the federal government is today, literally today in terms of cybersecurity strategies and sprint activities and things that are really top priority, I think we look at multi-factor authentication, and I think too many years have gone by where we've talked about two-factor authentication in PIV use and two-factor authentication in only PIV use. And really the conversation around derived credentials, around alternatives to PIV have kind of been mitigated or delayed or put as second fiddle to options for PIV. And that, given the known attack vectors, given the known risks that we have, really looking at embracing multi-factor authentication, even if it isn't an ideal scenario of PIV. What are my options other than PIV that I can really embrace today and at least start significantly mitigating my stuff? So if I can do some strong multi-factor authentication, if I can do good cyber hygiene, I have a good basis for building upon that stuff. So I think that's clearly an area where the federal space is going right now. But in addition to just kind of the core capabilities, I think we're seeing with the development of OPM, with IRS, when we look at Anthem and other organizations like that, there's another aspect of I think, priorities and visibility that we're doing. One, and particularly for CMS, is how are we managing our privacy portfolio? How are we managing the data that is PII or PHI or other sensitive information? And how do we manage those portfolios in a much more risk-based manner so that I'm not looking at 207 systems at CMS, or if I was looking at 650 systems at DHS, they're not all created equally. I've got some systems with 1 billion records in them, and I got some with 1 million records in them, and I got some with no records in them, and they really don't get the same amount of attention. They don't get the same amount of risk to the organization, and I need to be able to treat them differently. And I think one of those aspects that is highly underrated is how we mature our security operations. How do we do our looking at security logs? How do we look at the tools that support those operational needs? And do we bring those to a different level when I'm managing $1 billion or 1 billion records versus 1 million records versus 10,000 records? And I think when you look at a combination of immediate operational activities such as hygiene and multi-factor, and you match it up with how we look at operations, we're going to be much further along in the game and stop tolerating, I can't do it, it's too hard, it's too expensive, it's too challenging right now, and moving out on those things. So I think, when I look at, the immediate challenges, it's getting over those hurdles of the barriers and figuring out how we want to embrace a lot of these activities, which we know for a long time have been really good for both the federal government and for the commercial space. But today we need to really be aggressive in how we adopt those in the federal space.
Okay, again, I'm Roger Clark. I'm the acting CISO at the Department of Commerce, and thanks, Chris. And we'll start this off just like any normal AA meeting. I'm Roger Clark, and we've been compromised. Who in here else has been compromised? I mean, if you're a federal government agency and you're not raising your hand, then you're quite frankly don't have a clue. So we have to operate as if we're known compromised. Everyone is. So you have to take that approach. Everyone talks about with the mandate report and all this, the advanced persistent threat and all that. You have to change your view. It's not event-driven anymore. It's behavioral analysis. You're looking for the anomalies that happen on your network that should not be happening. The advanced persistent threat is the insider threat. It's not your traditional insider. Yeah, you have to worry about those, but it's the advanced persistent threat is also now an insider on your network. It's true. So information sharing and the sharing of indicators of compromise so that an organization has situational awareness is very key. That's something that I want to announce that at minute 1 today, for those of you that are ex-military, at minute 1 this morning, my Enterprise Security Operations Center turned on to 24/7 operations. So it's been 5 years trying to build this program, trying to get funding for this program. It went live at 12:01 this morning. So I'm very happy to announce that. But when you have that situational awareness across 12 different organizations within a major department, which have such varying mission sets. Commerce is a holding company, if you want to put it back into the private sector. It's a holding company. No two things do the same thing together. So you got everything from weather to patent to census data to economic indicators to spectrum management. So there's no commonality there. Sharing that information across so that at least if we're not doing the right thing, at least we're doing the same thing, so therefore we can do course correction if necessary. So, Chris?
So I'll see your amalgamated program and raise you 152 years of program aggregation and accrual. USDA has one of the most interesting mission sets I've had the privilege to work with. And within that, you have a challenge from almost any scenario you can envision. You know, pick your sensitive data set. We'll find an instance of it somewhere in USDA. And so I guess when asked what is it I'm passionate about, for me it's really trying to bring common sense to security. And explain that for a bit. I came to this career, like most people in IT, having had 5 different careers in my life. I've been a developer, I've been a operations manager, network engineer, all the different pieces. And in all those, I found myself very frustrated with the security people because they just don't get it. They don't understand mission. They don't understand we're saving lives. We're doing the Lord's work, whatever it is in our mission space. Mission people love what they do. The challenge is, and I think as any CISO goes, you still have to be able to speak security to the program people. You still have to translate all the very urgent, compelling issues of the day into that so what factor. How does this impact what we're trying to get done? How do you take, yes, you really should be using 2-factor, and turn it to, okay, here's why knowing who your customers are and knowing their data stays put is important to them. And trying to bridge that gap is one of the challenges that keeps me getting up in the morning, because it is so very diverse, dynamic, a few other adjectives with a D. But it is a reason to try and keep pushing the envelope on what we're getting done and how we do it. So.
Thank you. It sounds like you guys are kind of thinking about the same problem in different ways. In the keynote yesterday, Mr. Inglis talked. He mentioned that we are defending the wrong things with the wrong people and holding the wrong people accountable. How do you think you're able to balance the needs of your mission and operational readiness of your actors with security needs on the IT side?
I'll put my organization's mission up against your organization. Oh, never mind. My job is not to secure data. My job is not to secure networks. My job is not to do any of those things that lock everything down. So my job is to enable the mission. And if the mission is not enabled, then I can be the most secure place in the world, and we are not doing what needs to be done. And that is a place that is new for a lot of security people. We are used to being the people who say no. We need not to say no, we need to say yes, and we are trying to. We're working very hard to say yes. And one of the challenges is, and I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to say what anyway. One of the challenges is industry is driving fast, and we have changed from a culture where, defense and government was really the driver of where industry was going, to a consumer culture, and many of you have heard me say this before, where all of your devices are consumer-driven devices, and every capability, if you can't do it today, probably tomorrow afternoon you can. And so there's a perception that that entire capability was built within 24 hours. So then there's a perception from your users that if you were a really good enterprise, you would be able to deliver that capability in 24 hours and secure it. Because from my side, and I think I'm actually at an advantage here, I have a whole bunch of agents who say, no, that information cannot be lost. Now, how they decide not to lose it is another question. But at least they have someplace in their mind the idea that it's important that the data have confidentiality, have integrity, and be available when needed. And so they have at least that kind of base mindset. And that came over time. They didn't initially do that because they all had pieces of paper that they walked around and, But now when everything's online, they understand that that is an important thing, and so the data element itself is important. So people know what data they own. When it's their case, they know who has that case and who's giving permission to that case, and those kind of pieces are clear to them. What's not necessarily clear is why they have to have this in a centralized place, or how to make it happen with the right two-factor authentication. How is the infrastructure working securely? How are the other pieces going down that path, and making sure that the right people understand what it is that needs to happen. And then making sure that the data can go where it needs to go in a timely manner, which is a very challenging thing, because our primary network is not the unclassified network. So we move data into and out of different networks a lot, because at the end of the day, it all has to go over to the Department of Justice for prosecution. Well, not all of it, but a lot of it. So if something's getting prosecuted, that data needs to move there. So the whole challenge of enabling the mission my predecessor used to say, it is a rich and complex tapestry. And so both protecting and enabling are both really challenging components of this.
You're not just standing up firewalls now, you're a center for innovation to find out new ways to accomplish the mission.
Yeah, one of the previous panels talked about how to do innovation. I have, a lot of agents out there innovating and just trying to rein that in. So the whole question of shadow IT, I don't imagine any of you has any problem with shadow IT. But it's an interesting challenge, because it's on or off the network, and because they're really focused on, I don't have a challenge with people being engaged in this mission. They are engaged in this mission. They want to do this stuff. And getting the pieces, so it's like, oh, wait, here's a way to do it. It's like every time you turn around, they're getting around things. It's like, wait, don't do that, please. Let's enable that. But it takes us longer to enable it than for them to work around it. So, yeah, it's...
Emery?
Let me add to that. It's like, and if you can get to of a different kind of environments that we're having to work with, I don't know if that'd be CMS and FBI, and the fact that, not only do we obviously have to have a secure environment for enabling the mission, but, what's very different for the CMS environment is also, enabling, one, the aspect of transparency with our consumers. We have millions and millions of people using Medicare, Medicaid, healthcare.gov, who we need to be very transparent in the data that we collect, why we collect it, how we're using that information. We talked about innovation, talking about how do we make that information available, either identifiable or non-identifiable, so that we can improve innovation in healthcare services to the consumers in the U.S. So I think, when we talk about enabling a mission, it really does, add that complexity and that layer of, do I really own the data, or do I not really own the data, and I'm just kind of borrowing the data? Maybe it's for a year, maybe it's for 10 years, whatever that data is that I'm going to be able to leverage for my organization, based on, federal regulations and federal rules. But I think, it provides an interesting dynamic of how do you enable security, both for your own protections, but also for enabling the consumer to be able to safely use that information. I think we've all seen OPM and we've all seen IRS in the recent news, and it was like, it's easy to say that you're going to enable this environment for the public to be able to access their own data and so forth, but there are a lot of inherent risks in that, because a lot of our designs, our architectures, and our controls that we based on were for our control and for our access, and really didn't, emphasize the consumer so much. And how do we go back and make sure that, we're able to actually tell that, John Smith A is different than John Smith B versus John Smith C. And when you're talking about millions and millions of records, it is really not easy to do that. I can tell you, just from the number of privacy incidents I have on the millions of, postal mail messages that go out. When you start adding electronic mail to that and so forth, it just compounds the challenge. So,
On that note, Roger, could you talk just a little bit about the importance of information sharing, and real-time monitoring, looking for anomalies, and specifically within that area, how do you mitigate the risk of so many false positives when looking at anomalies?
Well, actually, I want to go back to one thing that
Yes.
they said first. Sorry, I'm sorry. But one of the key aspects in trying to sell security is, how do you sell security to a researcher? The whole purpose for doing the research is to get something published and get it out to the public, okay? So we've had a large uphill battle to sell security of why is it important to research organizations. So we've used the approach that if you spend your life doing research on a certain project, how would you like it if that information got out and the information is totally wrong? And it has your name on it. Okay? That's how you have to bring it back to the mission of why security is important to them. So I just wanted to add that one into the mix, since that was unfortunately a long uphill battle that we've had to hopefully try to get ahead of. Information sharing and just having the real-time visibility onto what's going into your networks and what's going on is key. Now, we've been operating, across 8 different security operations centers within the department. We are commerce, so we buy from everybody. So 10 different SIM tools across those 8 security operations centers. Really, the integration and all that is not there. Bringing things into a centralized port so that at least the headquarters unit knows what's going on across the department has been very instrumental to us. It is not a comfortable feeling when the secretary calls you to her office and says, why did I just get asked about this situation at a White House meeting? And the CIO and the CISO of the department have no clue. Okay, so that's not a comfortable situation. Centralization of those activities at the department level at least helps it spawns collaboration between the other operating units. What have they seen? Is it going on in your operating unit? Is it going on here? How have we corrected it? How have you done it in the past to get to these, to mitigate these types of activities? We're just starting this journey. So I don't have a firm answer on how do you do the false positives, because we're anticipating we're going to have a lot of fails. It's just the nature of the game. You're going to have a lot of fails when you're starting off. When you can't boil the ocean. NOAA alone, and I know we got at least one NOAA person here can attest to this, gets over 1 billion hits a week on their firewall. Okay, how can you go through 1 billion hits in a week? It's just not humanly possible.
I liked the idea of us turning our focus and prioritization to not being out in the property at the fence line, patching up the fence, but to be in the house, defining who are the individuals we're protecting, the treasures we're protecting, and protecting those things that are most important, prioritizing, and then organizing our searches through the data and our continuous monitoring systems to focus on those things. Speaking of those additional things, yes.
I'm sorry, if I can.
Yes.
I realize that it's sort of not cool to talk about perimeter defense these days, but with the whole advent of software-defined networks, and I think we're really going to come full circle on this. And I still, while it is not the only solution in place, to not pay attention also to perimeter defense seems to me foolhardy. In the same way that not having a signature-based approach to detection is also, yes, we need to do behavioral anomalies, and we need to do a lot more than we've been doing. But we also need to stick with some of the basics and make sure that we have those covered still, and
You're
not
talking about layering.
Yeah, absolutely layering. And yeah, we have a perimeter that is no longer as well understood as it used to be, but it doesn't mean the perimeter isn't there. It just means that we have to look at a bunch of different levels of depth and do our protections at many more levels.
Those perimeter defenses help you weed out the chaff so you can concentrate on the things that you really need to look at. So yeah, I agree. They're totally what. Yeah,
it's like they're not enough, but they're.
Right. I mean, just like antivirus. Antivirus catches what? Maybe 50% on a good day.
Right.
So it's looking for those. Yeah. I'm trying to be kind to the antivirus community. Okay.
And
I hope there's none in the audience. So.
Maybe collaborating on what we should be looking for is a valuable intellectual property of the federal government. In this conference, I realized that, oh my goodness, not only should we be monitoring for people hitting the perimeter or hitting the system, but what about elevated privileges? If I have an administrator who's on site doing work, and I see permissions being used of other administrators that are not there, Am I monitoring for that? Am I looking for the abuse of elevated privileges?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that being the second phase of your attack. I mean, the first attack, getting into the system, the second being the elevation of privileges, and then the lateral movement. Absolutely, we're looking for that. And being able to detect lateral movement is a critical component. You know, what should really be happening on these systems? Are they doing things from the location that they need to be doing them from? Or is this kind of, you know, should that process ever be writing to this place? I mean, those kind of questions. That's the behavioral question.
Right, exactly. Why is the system admin logging in, or let's even go down further. Why is this director of sales accessing a server in a different geographic area that she has no need to? And it's the first time that they've ever done it. That's an indication you probably want to take at least an investigation. There could be a very good business reason. They may be covering for somebody who's out on vacation or something, but you got to at least check into it.
And I think, you know, when you look at it, you know, one of the challenges that you see, both in the federal space, but in so many companies, especially small organizations, is do we have the right people and the right resources? If we're talking about large organizations, which are only now starting to set up 24/7 shops, you know, how many of the smaller organizations within that greater body still do not have that 24/7 shop? And, you know, our actors are not stopping at the end of the close of the business day, either here or overseas for that matter.
I thought they stopped at the bell at the stock exchange.
Well, they have the 9 to 5, but theirs is a different 9 to 5.
Oh, jeez. Okay, thanks.
You know, and I think when you look at that, I think, you know, we can start doing 24/7 across the board, but we still have a limitation in terms of the tools and the people's skill sets to run those tools and that visibility.
I think there
to
is
satisfactorily get it in a very consistent and repeatable manner.
I think there is a risk, though, of mission creep. I mean, there are not enough resources to check everyone on what gambling sites, or are they spending more than 10 minutes a day shopping, or whatever your reasonable use policy allows. I think, you know, nobody wants to be the net nanny. Nobody has the resources to be the net nanny. And finding that balance point between, you know, the critical security risk behavior and all the rest of the HR issues that keep trying to get shoved towards security is a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. So we also have the insider threat program in my organization, and one of the biggest challenges is they're like, oh, well, he seems to be spending a lot of time on the web. It's like, you know what? That's an HR issue. That is not my problem. If you have a performance problem, deal with it in a performance way. If you have a contractor performance problem, you've got contracting officers, and you have people who could deal with those things. I'm looking for people doing bad things on the network, whether it is an actual insider or a masked outsider. Those are the pieces that I need to make. But they're not the ones who are sitting there on gambling sites doing things or whatever. You know, it's like that's a performance issue. But yeah, I do not, absolutely, the security scope creep piece of it needs to be addressed.
That's a good point. A lot of these issues, too, are operational. They may not be an IT problem. They may be a problem with how the person is following policy to use the technology or the tool. Maybe they're going outside of what they're supposed to be doing as we put all of these tools together. We've heard of the Internet of Things. We now are managing devices in addition to person access. And long before this was a buzzword, we've had to evolve our security practices to deal with these things. Chris, what are some of the things that you guys are doing to deal with the Internet of Things?
Well, in my mind, it ties back to some of the earlier conversations around innovation. You know, in the previous panel of questions posed, well, how do we innovate? And I put it to you that the millennials were worried about innovating in order to create a space for them. They're already innovating. The challenge is to get them to bring what they're doing to you. In agriculture, there's a huge, you know, movement, if you will, but a lot of attention already moving on the technical farmer, which means looking at the integration of the Internet of Things, of, you know, the systems that are running their feeding programs and the machinery and the GIS to track it and the soil sampling. All these things are becoming automated in cheap, you know, low-cost consumer fashion, which means security is usually not a core component of those things. So one of the things we are trying to do, try being the operative word here, we work with our component agencies and their security programs, who in turn work with their program areas, who in turn work with the people who are actually out in the field. So the challenge is to try and create an open enough framework at the policy level for the department for them to be able to try an experiment with something, to be able to try a technology and fail. and be okay to fail. That's a phrase that doesn't get used very much in government, because everything we do is a success, otherwise you'll have to answer why, right? Well, the reality is not every idea is a winner, and to be able to allow to fail is an important part of that cycle. So I know policy sounds like a very tired answer for a very dynamic area, but really it is that framework to provide cover for these program areas to try what they're doing.
Arlette talked about the ability to innovate, become a center of innovation, not just a center of no. And you're talking about maybe look at a model to delegate this ability to look for new ways to do things and keep them safe in that process as they try and fail.
Oh yeah, the end users are always going to run faster than security. That's a given.
And maybe that can be leveraged. We integrate with Google quite a bit, and Google has a saying, fail often, fail well. And they hope that through multiple protected experiences, they can have a higher quality product, a higher quality service.
I think that's one of the pieces, you said protected capabilities, because there are things you really can't fail at. I mean, there are things that are extremely expensive to fail at. You need to make sure that when you are innovating and taking those risks, you're doing it in areas where the consequences are manageable. And I think that's a place where the security side of it and the mission side of it need to work together in a way that says, okay, this is a risk that is calculated and reasonable to take.
Emery, how does your organization determine where to apply your assets and resources?
I think, we look at, first of all, where is all of our privacy assets and data that we're managing at the time? Obviously, some of that is core information, which gets core resources and core visibility. And, when you look at the systems which are processing, highly sensitive information in the numbers of billions of records each year, we're looking at systems that literally get resources 2 to 3 times as big as any other systems in the environment. And it gets that visibility, it gets that individual hand-holding as we go along. But then we look at ones that are probably a little bit more in the middle. And when we look at cloud computing, it's like which ones can we start moving into the cloud? Which ones are opportunities for maximum reuse by leveraging something like a Salesforce or Amazon Cloud, and probably less risky to do that, and there are probably a lot of reuse benefits out of those environments, and I think that's where you start seeing cloud a lot more right now. But when you look at those high value assets, I can put high, however you want to identify those high value assets. You really do have to prioritize those resources. They do get the most amount of people, the most amount of hand-holding, the most amount of monitoring and testing and assessment as we go through. And if I don't do it, I know Congress will make sure I do it. So, it's not a question as to whether or not I'm going to do it. It's a question of, is it going to be something driven by us, or is it going to be driven by an external organization who thinks they know what my high-value assets are?
Roger, how is your department handling this move into the cloud environment?
Slowly with some measured steps, just to be frank. We've migrated all of our email services across the operating units to 2 major cloud vendors. We won't discuss who they are, but so we have migrated the mail portion. Now it's trying to identify, again, which are the appropriate data sets. It's all about understanding what the data sets are and which are the correct ones to go, which ones need to be protected, or when do they go? Because a lot of the data that we generated, or that we generate, and I did find out that Commerce, and correct me if I'm wrong, has been said to be the second largest data producer behind DoD in the federal government. So when you consider, census data, weather data, patent and trademark, all of that, so we have a big tie here. It makes it awful difficult to identify all of those data sets and apply the mosaic effect across of what happens if this data set is released, this one's not, but there is a tie-in. What's the inferences that can be drawn into that? We're beginning those processes. Luckily, we now have a new chief data officer on board, which helps. So trying to lead that charge. But the classification of the data sets is key before you can move anything. I know that was very circular because I'm winging it.
No, that's a very comprehensive answer.
Okay.
This next question is for the entire panel. What are your agencies doing to better leverage PIV and HSPD 12 to provide multi-factor access, tie that into your hiring and onboarding process, tie it into your physical control system? What are your thoughts as to pushing that multi-factor authentication standard to greater use within your environment?
Oh, I'll start. I think it's kind of a mixed story because we have a large business model where we are pushing out the management and ownership of data on our behalf to commercial entities, which may or may not ever touch our systems. So, PIV is a great model if you own the infrastructure and you own the people that are involved in that process. It becomes a significant challenge when, in particularly the CMS case, I'd say 80% of the population is not a federal employee or directly located on a CMS core network. So when you look at it that way, I think, the model for HSPD 12 is great. I think, the understanding of, the background investigation, making sure that they have a strong credential is an ideal scenario. I think when you get into this kind of diverse environment where you're working and, you're using this model of a trusted partner throughout your organization, that you're going to have to make some adjustments for that process. Because we figure that if we want to go to 100% PIV through the organization, it's a $140 million budget item. And I can assure you no one has $140 million lying around for something like that. And that's not, that's not something you just collect, by the way, in sweeps at the end of the year or something like that. It is something that you have to, acknowledge, is that really the best use of those dollars, or can you come up with alternatives in different scenarios that you want to, try to leverage? And then that only covers, core contractors and core services. And then, when I start looking at my relationship with healthcare providers themselves and the doctors and the people interfacing with our data, that becomes an even larger bill. So, you've got to kind of draw those boundaries as you go forward. But where it makes sense, I think, PIV is a really strong model. And, if you can do PIV and single sign-on, it's an even stronger model and so forth. But you have to recognize that, what are my options when I'm going to be using mobile devices? What are my options when I'm working in a place that only connects, on a very sporadic basis to transfer data and so forth? So, I think there are a lot of good justifications, but I think there's a lot of flexibility that you need to do going forward to, find the model that best fits and best accommodates your environment.
Are any of you thinking about PIV-I as maybe a way to solve issues for non-employees or temporary workers? Has that been something that maybe you have looked into?
I have, and we've definitely seen that, in terms of cost savings. So instead of $140 million, it might only cost me, $90 million in terms of options for that. So again, $90 million, not chump change, not just lying around for someone to pick up. But I do think it's a pretty strong model.
Taking this idea of strong authentication and multi-factor authentication one step further, what are you, each of you, doing to think about how to especially handle elevated privileged users? Is there a model for more carefully managing their access and the risk associated with their use of systems?
Well, so Yeah, I mean, you know, you identify them explicitly, and you identify how they access their account, their privilege accounts, and make sure that we track that and understand the nature. This goes to the insider threat question, and then which also goes to the question of what kind of data are you collecting about your employees and about the activities that they do. And it looks at the relative risk that each individual represents to the organization, and also how you can understand what the activities are and whether they're authorized or not. But tying privileged activities to privileged activity requests so that you can actually track them according to a ticketing system, and so you understand exactly who's doing what, when, and whether they're authorized to do that. More of an objective than an achieved thing most of the time, although we're working down that path. Making sure that you understand exactly who has the privileges, what level of privileges they are, and when they are there. And so then when you're working through your logs and things like that, you can say, okay, these ones are all legitimate privileged users who are doing these things and have been doing them ongoing. As Roger was saying, it's like, yeah, somebody doing something that's like, well, that's unusual. Should that have been happening? It may be a false positive. It may not be a false positive. It merits investigation. And when you're talking about the billion of events that hit our firewalls every day, yeah, we don't look at all of those, but when we look down through what are people doing on the systems, it's a large number, and there's a large enough number of privileged users. We need to understand who it is, what are they doing, and then also limiting what those accounts can actually do. So when they are logging in as a privileged user, they are no longer able to access some of the things that they can access as a normal user. So they have to go back and do, yeah, it's a pain in the neck for them. I don't care. Live with it.
And I think another important piece to that is we have to look at re-architecting our networks to provide network segregation so that those folks that have those privileged access only it's limited to a certain enclave or a certain network segment, so that you really have to limit the access of who has that master root domain account at the top level, and very closely monitor. Some of the things that we've done is for a couple of systems that we have is if it is a master domain user, not only doing the PIP cards, but we've also incorporated that you have two people have to know the password. So one person knows the first 6 characters and the other person knows the second 6 characters in order to, to activate the account to do that particular function because they are so sensitive.
And I think, on the positive side, though, the one thing that we are seeing is the technology is starting to catch up in this area. 5, 6, 10 years ago, the ability to do that behavioral analysis for a segment of users really was not very strong. And you are seeing quite a few leaps and bounds and innovation in that technology. And I think, one of the challenges as we're talking here is that, right now or historically, you've had to spend a lot of time kind of, quote unquote, training your systems to recognize this bad behavior. So that you know how to get through billions and trillions of notifications each day. But the other piece is that you're training these systems, and what we're seeing is a 20% turnover in contractors every year too. So this issue of pivoting them alone is quite a costly thing at 20%. But you also have to build a system and build an infrastructure and an architecture that can kind of support that turnover, because you don't want to be building it on an individual, obviously. You want to be building it on a role and a capability.
I think in the last 2 comments I heard an idea of separation of duties. And it sounds like in this idea, an idea of maybe simplifying and automating the onboarding process, offboarding process, making that a little bit more effective and efficient. With NetIQ, I once did an identity and access management integration for a research company. I won't name the research company. But we noticed that most of their data intrusion attempts, requests to read intellectual property documents that people didn't have access to, the access was denied for, more of those requests came from inside the firewall than outside the firewall. What are you doing in terms of separation of duties to help mitigate those kinds of risks? the idea of having a shared administrative password is perhaps one of those things. Are there other things that you're doing to identify separation of duties, conflicts, rules, and enforce those?
Well, I mean, separating the data from the network layer and separating what kinds of privileged users, so you identify different types of privileged users for different types of functions. So, your network people can't get to your databases, can't get to your workstation admin kind of pieces of it. Those are other separations. Obviously, enforcing two-factor authentication across all of the privileged users, no matter what the two factors are, make sure there's at least two factors. And really just paying attention to who it is that has privileged access, because I think that's one of the hard parts. I think most people now do this moderately well, but nobody does it really well, understanding who are your privileged users, because you have a lot of systems out there. And you don't necessarily know what all those systems are all the time. You know most of the systems most of the time, and then you end up with a few of them that have got, oh yeah, we needed this one for this thing that was really important at that point in time, and now it's still there, and it has to be there forever and ever and ever. And I can't be alone in that world. But understanding who it is and then going back and saying, okay, now who is this? And, security is a game of inches, and it's also a game of exceptions. Oh, we just opened that firewall for this thing. Did you close it again? Oh, we just changed this rule for this thing. Okay, and did you unchange it? Is it back to where it was supposed to be? And following those pieces of it is very hard. And that's why, with privileged users, it's like, oh, and then you got privileges to this and that and the other thing. Going back down that path and taking them off again. And that's one of the pieces that happened, in fact, as a result of WikiLeaks, I believe, is that, you go down that privileged user list every quarter or so and say, do these people still need this access? No, take it away. Or if the answer is, I don't know, take it away. And so the just in time and just enough privileges. That actually, I think we're going to get to the place soon where that is a thing that everybody can do, and then just do provisioning of privileges at every level as needed, instead of having anybody sitting there with a default, God privilege.
I hear you saying that.
I think there is a cost to that.
Correct.
There is a cost to that.
I mean, there are very direct costs. You take away those privileges to limit to your admin folks. You need more admin folks. You can squeeze a balloon on one end, but the functions are still needed. And I think that's where the challenge is. I mean, there is a wide spectrum from, easy access office automation, people sitting in their cubes, to, your agents running in the field with guns. Those both are easy to define. It's that squishy area in the middle. Are we going to make a firefighter have to make sure they have their PIV card? Probably not, at least not while they're firefighting. Operational flexibility is still something that most missionaries have to deal with in some aspect. And I get nervous whenever we start assigning absolute cures to things. I think there needs to be that place for risk acceptance and understanding on the part of the businesses.
Absolutely. You have to understand the mission and then operate within those constraints. I do think that there is some low-hanging fruit. Just by turning on PIV-based access for some agencies that we've worked with, we have seen immediately a whole bunch of people, in your example, firefighters, we have seen a whole bunch of people just lose access all of a sudden because they were using a shared username and password that we didn't even know about. It was an individual username, but there were 13 people using that credential, and that went away when we forced PIV. But you do have to weigh the pros and cons of each decision. It sounded like, Arlette, the other idea that you had was access governance or certification, recertification of access. I work with many people that used to be domain administrators or root admins on Unix systems that as they've worked for the agency for 25 years, they've accumulated and accumulated and accumulated access. If I were to compromise their Active Directory account, I would have access to everything. And I think that's an interesting idea, to identify those elevated privilege users and begin to mitigate and reduce access where it makes sense operationally and with the mission. That's challenging to do. One time, assisting an agency with FISMA reporting, I couldn't even get a straight answer on who our elevated privilege users are. What is an elevated privileged administrator? It was different every time I did the data pull.
But
Definition.
yeah, but I think you hit on something very important. We're very good at provisioning the accounts, we're very bad at deprovisioning. When people change jobs, they leave the agency, that's where we need to tighten up. And it's following that, tighten up that process on the back end to eliminate. And that's where reviewing the access on a time, on a periodic basis is really key. Are they even still in the organization? We recently did a search and we found an employee that had an account that had left the organization about a year ago. And so that's not a good thing. So is one that had dropped through the cracks, but those are the ones that you have to follow up on to make sure that they're not there.
We've had some interesting comments and ideas on the things that are on each of your top of mind awareness. For the last few minutes of this discussion, I'd like to open up the opportunity for anybody in the audience to ask a question and maybe clap it together. In the back, yes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of discussion on what I call security hygiene, and that's supported by the CDM program, Sandstop, CAD, all the regular stuff, right? I really only covered probably half of that, so you get really low hanging fruit of what's on your network, vulnerabilities, talk about really identity management, RBAC, and all things that are associated with that. Then you get into the little tougher areas, which we haven't discussed, all the incident management, response, etc. But in light of all this, you now have, for the last 5 years, venture capitalists funding roughly 1,500 new ventures.
It's fun.
But all creating all this new stuff. I guess sort of a two-part question to you. The first question would be, or part of the question would be, with all that coming now at you, you guys got to look at a lot of stuff, so you're really cool. How do you actually look at it? It's not part of the question. But does that create even more categories of security hygiene that we have to deal with, or does it augment current categories? Part one of the question. And the second one is, how do you keep up with trying to translate all this into English so you get funding?
You get funding?
What? Money?
Yeah. Well, I tell you, part of the biggest problems now is with the vastly changing mobile environment. We recently got a request to standardize that we're going to automatically, accept these list of 25 applications. Well, security never looked at them because we didn't know that it's chasing the bright, shiny object of the day, of which somebody identifies. And we're trying to figure out how do we go through and vet those particular applications for use on our network, because we know people are going to go around. I mean, it's not like we're going to go out and advertise all of our services on Angie's List and let people vote on it, but we still have to come up with some sort of vetting process of how to get these in. But we have to move smartly because, again, we can't say no. They're going to find a way around. So it's a very difficult, and we're trying to struggle with that in the last couple of weeks, is trying to figure out a process to do that.
See, my answer would be FATAR is my friend. If I can drive the need to recognize security and build that in to the person who's bringing the application to me, then there's a good chance it will actually get done well. If it has to wait until it comes up to the department level for my shop to review, we've missed the opportunity.
Is there a way that you can tie into mission objectives to bring more budget from those mission actors?
Sure. I mean, sort of.
Depends on the agency.
Yeah, kind of, well,
Yeah, because
getting it up front and into the mission owner and getting it onto their budget, and making sure things like, secure app development are part of your core mission, and that the monitoring piece of it is built into the development aspect and pushing that very, very far forward in the thing, and making sure that, the CNA or ANA or whatever you call it, process is really paid attention to earlier rather than later, which, we've been fighting that battle forever. The question about, do we have new things that we didn't have, the whole MDM question, we never had to pay attention to MDM before. We had, everybody had BlackBerries. We all had the Bez server, and we got beautiful logs from that. The other one is the, cloud security broker question, and making sure that we have the right eyes on what's going on in the cloud, what's going to and from, And so that, and then whole question of how are you managing your risk related to the cloud is the, who do you trust where? Because, you know, bottom line is you really aren't transferring that risk. You're only transferring the responsibility for maintaining that capability. So you need to still have an understanding of who's managing what and what can they get to at the bottom layers of your stack.
We had another question.
Yeah, I want to go back, something Roger said earlier, that everyone has...
It was Chris.
Head is going to be breached at some point.
Yeah.
But I didn't hear any mention of anything about any type of encryption or access control, and I'm wondering, is that something you guys are doing for that data that does leave the barn? Is there encryption or some sort of access control so that what's taken can't be read?
Well, the problem is in certain cases, if you have the appropriate privileges, it doesn't matter where you encrypt it or not because you already are accessing the data unencrypted. So you just save off what you got and go with it. So applying encryption, you have to do it at the right point. But you also need to have the capabilities to inspect encrypted traffic that's going in and out of your network. And you, of course, have to watch out so the privacy guys are not banging on your door of why am I capturing your Bank of America logon, you know, that kind of thing. But you have to be able to see it, and I don't think there's a holy grail for that.
And I think when you look at it, and when you look at the incidents that have occurred recently, encryption without multi-factor authentication is useless because they've stolen the single-factor authentication. So, stealing the encryption, that's easy once you've got the credentials.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, if you do encryption without multi-factor, you've definitely limited yourself. However, I think at the same time, as Roger just said, is, being able to monitor that encrypted traffic on our side as well is very critical to our success in the long run. And again, it becomes part of that, defense in depth with our perimeter defenses and making sure we can see what is going out. And right now, you see all kinds of mixes where people rely exclusively on encryption, but single-factor authentication, so their own. Or you see that they've encrypted everything and they believe they're safe, but then they have no way of actually detecting what just went out the door. Or so you see this kind of common issue with encryption that you can implement it a lot of bad ways, and people have managed to do that over and over and over again. And making sure that you get those pieces together are really important. And I think people are only now, kind of letting some of those things come together again. Whereas they thought, it's like I could do this, or I could do this, or I could do this. It's like, no, you kind of got to do all three of them to do this successfully. I think you're starting to see that attitude change at least.
And if you do achieve perfect encryption and you've got it covered, then your chief data officer and your open data people are going to complain because you've now made it impossible to mash it up in interesting ways.
We have not reached that magic point yet where we can both see the data and hide the data. And the same challenges for the external organizations, which I know you have and we have too. It's like, how do you share securely an encrypted data without sending an email and then following it immediately with password or something, which is ridiculous. Yeah.
Leo, yes.
I've got one for you, beginning panel. Everybody told you I did.
Okay.
We have just a couple minutes for questions and answers.
While we were beginning the panel, everybody was talking about the key focus of what needs to get done, and very good points. And an email went out just about that time from NCAT's FNR saying to everybody, if we detect that you still haven't patched your vulnerabilities on your high-value assets, we're coming after you. And Tony Scott is after everybody to get your two-factor going. And this whipping is happening. Maybe, let's stipulate it might work. Is this what it's going to take? And if it works, what will happen next? Is this a good model for how we finally get some of these things fixed? I'd like to see what everybody thinks.
Well, I've asked one vendor to look into something for me, and that is time division multiplexing for senior executives. Quite frankly, there's going to be more coming. You just don't know what it is. So those are good steps. Yes, we're all getting beat up about that on a daily basis. The good thing that I can see this as an advantage is it now has some of the things that we've been preaching for a long time now has senior management focus, and that is helping us try to concentrate some resources in areas that we know that we have some gaps.
And I think when you look at it, honestly, I'm not going to say, OPM was a good thing, but I will say that it's definitely raised visibility, and it's made personal to every single person who's working in the federal space. And, they can now relate to, there is a security challenge, and that, when I'm looking at my mission and how I'm, enabling that mission, yes, some of that will help us get over some of those, I'm not going to say, some of those business barriers of seeing the need for some of these controls and capabilities. But again, it comes down to how well you can implement that. So it doesn't really matter how much you get thrown at you. It's how well are you managing it, and do we have the right people able to prioritize within the organizations and say, it's like, okay, well, that's the direction, but, there's a good application of it and there's a bad application of it, and making sure that those right people are in the right spots.
Right. And just like Google Maps, it gives you, you got 3 or 4 different paths. You got to figure out which is the right path to get you to the destination.
That's a good analogy. Right now is a time of opportunity for each of us. Arlette, Emery, Roger, Chris, we appreciate your comments and your thoughts today, and we appreciate participation. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much to GTRA.